That's Ambassador Minister Elihu Washburn on the left, and that's Paris aflame. The Communards tried to burn the city down, wanted to destroy the Louvre, wanted to destroy everything. Succeeded in burning the Palace of the Tuileries, succeeded in setting the Hotel de Ville on fire, and that's not an exaggeration of what it looked like. Washburn watched from the top of the American legation, a building off the Champs-Élysées that's still there, and he had there was 6 floors to it, and he watched the city burning, and that's part of one of the more amazing descriptions in his diary. That's Mary Cassatt on the left, a self-portrait, watercolor, wonderful self-portrait, and John Singer Sargent on the right in his studio with his most celebrated and sensational portrait, so-called Madame X, which is a whole story unto itself and which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum today. And that is the Statue of Liberty rising over the city of Paris, which was another American, French-made American sensation. They built it there to see what it looked like first before taking it down and packing it up and shipping it to New York. And as you can see, it towered up over the city in a most conspicuous fashion and was quite a sight to be seen by anyone who came to Paris or who was living there. That's Thomas Edison on the right, another American who took Paris by storm. He was besieged by idolizers. He was the rock star of his day, and so bothered by it that he went and hid out with an American friend of his who happened to be a painter who took advantage of Edison's presence day after day to paint that portrait, which hangs now in the National Portrait Gallery. And there's St. Gaudens up on the left, painting by Cox, painting that's in the Metropolitan Museum. On the lower left is an interior of their apartment in Paris, done by Gussie St. Gaudens, who was a painter, quite good, and that's her portrait, done by a friend, another artist, Thomas Dewing. And on the right is the statue of Admiral Farragut in Madison Square. And up, this is, oh, excuse me, wait a minute, back. Yeah. Wait a minute, sorry. Here, there. This is the old Madison Square Garden, and that's the tower, and the top of the tower was Diana, the famous sculpture of the Diana, the mythical Diana, by St. Gaudens. So in that one photograph, you have 2 St. Gaudens masterpieces. That tower and the building are no longer there, but the statue is the Metropolitan Museum. And this is the Sherman statue with the goddess of victory leading Sherman to victory at the end of the decisive, overwhelming march to the sea, which pretty well ended the war. It's a very powerful piece. And if you take time to look at Sherman's face, you see that it is by no means an appealing face. It's grim, it's marked, it's scary. It's the face of a madman. And Sherman, you remember, is the one who said so famously, "War is hell. War is all moonshine." And St. Gaudens, in that face, has captured the look of a man who has looked into hell. The goddess of victory is not, her expression is not one of, "We've done it, aren't we terrific, on to greater things." It's not one of exhilaration or happiness. It's a kind of dazed look, as if she too has been through something and doesn't quite know what to make of it yet. But there's one more extremely interesting thing about the goddess of victory there. The woman who posed for it, whose name was Hetty Anderson, was an African American. And most people have no idea about that. And whether St. Gaudens chose her as a kind of symbolism of an African American leading the Union Army to victory, I can't say. No one can say. I suspect he did. He only said that she was one of the most beautiful models he'd ever had posed for him, and that he was ever grateful that she took the part. And that's the cover of my book. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I have no idea how long I've talked. The problem is not to get me to talk, it's to get me to stop talking. But I would be very happy to take a few questions if you have any. Yes, sir, over on the end.
Yeah, your book is about how our two countries have worked together over the years, but the last few decades we've kind of drifted apart. Why do you think of that is, and what do we need to do to get back together again?
Well, I think we are getting back together again, noticeably, and it has to do with the leadership in both countries at the moment. Many people, Americans, have too little appreciation of how much we owe to the French, how much the impress of French participation in our growth and our development and in our way of life. After all, a French engineer designed the capital of our country, Pierre L'Enfant. After all, the country was more than doubled in size when Napoleon agreed to sell us the Louisiana Territory. We look at the map of the United States, and there are French names everywhere: rivers, towns, streets, colleges, universities, with French names. We may not pronounce them quite the same way that French do, but they're there, and for good reason. And anyone who grew up in Pittsburgh and went to a good school knows all about why it was Fort Duquesne and how the French and Indian War began here, and all of that is part of what one should know about the history of our country. What too few do know is that the Revolutionary War probably could not have continued, and thus we would not have been victorious if the French hadn't provided the funds needed to fight the war, along with the Dutch, to be sure. But French money really paid for our revolution. And almost no one has any idea that the army under General Rochambeau at Yorktown, the decisive ending conflict at Yorktown, the army under Rochambeau was larger than the army under Washington, and the only reason that surrender came is because the French fleet arrived at exactly the right time so that the British army couldn't escape from the peninsula at the end of the Virginia Peninsula. So they played the decisive part in our beginning war. Also, of course, as I'm sure most of you do appreciate, more Americans are buried, lie in rest in France than any other country in the world except our own, because of the two great wars in which our troops fought there. And if you've ever been to Normandy or the cemetery at the Argonne, you know the powerful experience, emotional experience that is. I find that most of the people who belittle France or say they don't like the French are people who've never been there, never been to Paris, never had dinner there. I hope very much that what I have written will help improve French-American relations. We have nothing to gain, only to gain from such a friendship. And I found, I don't speak French. My wife Rosalie doesn't speak French. We read sort of a little front page headlines and leads of news stories. But we have never been treated with anything but French friendliness and courtesy, as long as we made it clear that we want to learn French, that we're trying to pronounce it correctly and so forth. And we've, as a consequence, from time we've spent there, we've acquired a great many dear friends that mean a lot to us. Yes, another question. Yes, ma'am.
My question is about Henry Ossawa Tanner. And did he not go to Paris not for the obvious, but also because he was a black man and couldn't be accepted here?
The question is, why did Henry Tanner go to Paris? Was not just for the training, but because he felt that he couldn't be treated as he wished to be treated here. Certainly there was some element of that. He went primarily because Thomas Aikens urged him to do it. And when he got there, he was, of course, delighted by the fact that everybody treated him exactly as they treated everyone else. But he had such a lovely sense of humor and manner about him. He did find that if he went into a number of restaurants, he was not treated as though he were welcome. But it took him a while to figure out it wasn't because he was black, it was because he didn't drink wine. and all the profit was in the wine. So they didn't want this guy sitting there eating food that wasn't really going to pay back the restaurateur very well. And this is in his sketches of his life in Paris. Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes.
Were there any great or memorable mentor or relationships of the Americans that you profiled with French artists?
Yes. Was there any great mentor relationship between French artists or French scholars or whatever? I'll mention two. One was Carlos Duran, who was Sargent's master, and from whom Sargent learned an enormous amount. And particularly, he learned from Carlos Duran that Velázquez was a god and that he should go and study Velázquez, go to Madrid and do copies and so forth. And there's a pronounced effect on Sargent's work by that. If you know his great painting El Jaleo, which is of a Spanish dancer, it's very much with that. But the use of black and the drama of Sargent's work. The other one would be Dr. Louis, who was a professor of medicine in Paris at the École de Médecine, who had more effect on the American students than any of the other major and very great physicians under whom they studied. And I think a dramatic measure of that was when Holmes retired from the Harvard Medical School after his whole career there and gave his farewell address. When one thinks of all that he might have written about, all the friendships he had, all the adventures he'd had, both of the mind and otherwise, or about his son who became Justice of the Supreme Court, infinite number of choices he might have had. He chose to devote his whole talk to Dr. Louis and how indebted he was to that man, and they all were indebted to him. Because of what they learned from those Parisian doctors, they were able to come home and transform the teaching of medicine in this country. And I thought it was one of the most admirable salutes to teachers I've ever seen. There's no more important person in our society than our teachers. They are doing the work that really matters. And they need all the help and support and appreciation and respect that we can give them, particularly the best of them. And let's never, ever forget that. Let's never do anything that gets in the way of good teaching and good teachers. Thank you very much.